I voted.
Okay.
And hey, John Coffey's here.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi.
Greetings. Yeah. Oh.
You know the difference. I mean,
Okay. Mary Jo is back. We can start. I didn't want to punch anybody who showed up on time. So tonight we're going to be looking at the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. You know, particularly focused on the society at large, because that's where it gets really adventurous and interesting. And, you know, we hope that we don't have to very often do strenuous exercise of the right of conscience within the congregations. Looking at this principle, I realized, okay, this is the form in which it reads best. You know, right of conscience, and then the long thing about the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Logically, democratic process comes first. And then if there are problems with that, then we go to the right of conscience. And this is, you know, this is actually pretty significant stuff. One of the many roots of democratic process in American governance, it comes from congregational governance, congregational polity, that various of the religious groups brought over to North America when they invaded here. And democratic process is really important. For those who can operate in white, middle class, or better contexts, it very often works really well. But there are other people in other contexts who don't have as much access to democratic process. And there are times when democratic process fails or is manipulated to fail. Are any of those recent or threatened to be forthcoming?
They're too close for comfort.
Anyhow, at those points, an option is to exercise the right of conscience and attempt to repair democratic process, make it work more nearly well. So, some examples involving Unitarian Universalists. There's the situation of no more deaths. I think the Spanish is no más muertes. The failure of democratic process there is that safe, legal immigration has been made very difficult along the Mexican-US border, forcing migrants without means, without good access to stuff, to come on foot through very dangerous areas. No more deaths, places, water, and other supplies in the desert areas. It's officially, since 2008, a ministry of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tucson. And its aim is to end death and suffering in the US-Mexico borderlands. I think they are looking at it and thinking, dead people lack democratic process. Yeah. Now, a short time ago, a Unitarian Universalist, Scott Daniel Warren, was arrested because he had been actively involved in this and was seen interacting with 5 undocumented immigrants who needed the water, the socks, the food that he provided them. Between his arrest and trial, there were 88 bodies found in the area of Arizona desert where he had been doing this work. In his trials, the jury hung. They couldn't decide on either a conviction or acquittal. Ultimately, the charges were dropped. A few years earlier, 10 years ago, I guess, there were oil and gas leases being auctioned in Utah. These were favored by corporations and opposed by many people and voluntary organizations. The opposition to them said, exploring and developing these leases would promote climate change. Just the exploration threatens fragile natural areas and encroaches on or threatens sites that are sacred or at least culturally significant to indigenous peoples. And there had been programs on this at the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City, where there was a newish member, young man in his 20s, Tim DeChristopher. So on the day that the auction was being held, there were demonstrations outside the auction site. Tim DeChristopher was one of the folks from the church and other groups who decided to go in. And he decided to actually register for the auction. I think he took this action after the first few parcels, and he realized that they were being auctioned off for peanuts. And so he got an auction number and kept raising his paddle and bidding the price up, and looked over and saw another church member who was just weeping. And at that point, he shifted gears, apparently on impulse, and started bidding seriously. He became the successful bidder on 14 of the parcels that were particularly ones that were near Canyonlands National Park and Arches National Parks, 2 of the natural areas that would be threatened, particularly threatened. So he bid successfully on these 14 parcels. The problem was he didn't have the 1.8 million that he then owed. So he was arrested for interfering with a federal auction. Now, a couple of things. A month after that auction, a federal judge halted a number of the sales on the grounds that the Bureau of Land Management, which was conducting the auction, had not done what it had to do by law on environmental and historical issues. They had not cleared the hurdles to actually conduct the auction. But DeChristopher was tried and convicted on 2 counts of disrupting the auction. Many of his defense moves were suppressed, legal rules about what's admissible and what isn't. And he served 21 months of his 2-year sentence. And I did mention with a picture my Selma experience. There were two issues, really. Black citizens of Dallas County were being forced into a two-step process, signing an appearance book and then coming back on the few days each month when the registrar's office actually would be open to accept registrations. White folks have never had to do this. But also, we were arrested, tried, and convicted of contempt of court. And what we were in contempt of was a clearly unconstitutional ban by the county judge, a ban on any public gathering of 3 or more people, except for church. His ban had been thrown out in federal court almost instantaneously, something called the First Amendment. But that didn't keep him from enforcing it. In his courtroom, it was still good. Interesting. Yes, Lori.
If I remember, if I may quote you, he deserved your contempt.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And he, Judge Hare did have to put up with a little bit from us. The very best, we were tried as a group. The judge served as judge, assistant prosecutor, and prosecution witness. So we knew it was all fair. And we were tried as a group, but for some reason called up individually for sentencing, although all the sentences were the same. And each one of us, as we were called up, was asked if we had anything to say. And I did mouth off, but the very, very best was Ralph Featherstone, who was a SNCC worker, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Ralph was wearing bib overalls, which was sort of the SNCC uniform. And so Judge Hare called out, "Ralph Featherstone." And Featherstone walked up before the bench, hitched up his bib overalls, and said, "Your Honor, where I come from in Washington, D.C., I'm accustomed to being addressed as Mr. Ralph Featherstone." The judge turned a real pretty color. It was beautiful. But let's move on to some harder stuff. I think these are 3 fairly positive, defensible uses of the right of conscience in situations where democratic process really wasn't working real well, or in some cases even visible. But let's look at John Brown's 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. At the best, this one, I'd say, was dubious. Maybe it was a notable fail. But, what was the minimally desired democratic process here? Well, the minimally desired democratic process was to affirm the human dignity of everyone. This was coming 2 years after the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court. And the reality that that decision created was that it said no people of African descent can be recognized as citizens. Whew. Now, this probably rates as worst decision, certainly up there, one of the worst decisions the US Supreme Court has ever rendered. It was undone in the 1860s by the 14th Amendment, which specifies due process. It says if you're born in America, you're a citizen. And it's worth noting that Judge Amy Barrett questions the validity of the 14th Amendment. That scares the daylights out of me. But that just recognizing basic humanity wasn't the ultimate democratic process desired here. Ultimately, the end of slavery is what they were driving at. And the reality at that point, in 1859, was the end of slavery was opposed in Congress. Federal laws that moment were very bad. There had been armed struggle in Kansas over the extension of slavery into Kansas, Nebraska area. It was bad. It was bad. Now, John Brown had been deeply involved in the armed struggle in Kansas to, John Coffey is nodding, from Manhattan, Kansas. And, it was warfare out there between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. The anti-slavery forces shipped what were called Beecher Bibles. Reverend Mr. Beecher was a preacher, an evangelist, but in those shipping crates, there might be a layer of Bibles, but underneath there were rifles. Those were the Beecher Bibles. It was hairy, and that was a context in which John Brown had operated fairly brutally. From that background, he proposed this raid on the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His theory was his little armed band would raid the arsenal, get the armaments there, retreat into the Appalachian Mountains, and encourage an armed revolt by enslaved people. He would lead them to freedom. He pitched this idea to some people who had supported him in Kansas. Pitched it to Frederick Douglass, who was about as out there as anyone was on the cause of abolition. Douglass said no. Ultimately, there were 6 white men who reluctantly agreed to support this raid by John Brown. They were called, in retrospect, the Secret Six. 5 of the 6 in this band were Unitarians. And not just any old people. These were some fairly high-profile, justifiably high-profile people. One was the Reverend Theodore Parker, a wordsmith, a theological and political, well, maybe liberal in his own mind, radical in the eyes of many other people. And when I say wordsmith, this is somebody mid-19th century, you know some of his coinage. You know the moral arc of the universe. What does it do? It bends toward justice. That was Theodore Parker, picked up by Martin Luther King Jr. and then Barack Obama. That's a pretty good trio. And, you know, government of, by, and for the people. That's from a Theodore Parker sermon. That sermon was distributed to those across the country who had subscribed to his printed sermons. One of them was William Herndon, an attorney in Springfield, Illinois, who showed that copy, a copy of that sermon, to his law partner, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln polished it up a little bit. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. At Gettysburg. Good reuse. It could stand recycling like that. Another of the 6 was Samuel Gridley Howe, the leading educator of deaf people in the 19th century. Some notable successes. Samuel Gridley Howe was also, had a bit of an authoritarian streak and was a fairly miserable husband to Julia Ward Howe. But, you know, a leading citizen, somebody widely recognized and admired. And Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a minister, although really too radical to do well with most congregations, an agitator. He was involved in a couple of efforts to liberate fugitive slaves who had been taken captive. And writer. In later life, he was poetry editor for The Nation magazine for a number of years. And significantly, he was the person who nursed the poetry of Emily Dickinson into print. So, you know, the Secret Six were substantial people. Even they doubted that the raid could succeed, but they still provided the minimal underwriting to make it happen. Well, the raid did fail in every military objective. And having finally visited Harper's Ferry, it was, I think the military analysis is, don't do this. There is one road into town, and then you were up against 2 rivers. And so militarily, you don't go into some place that's hard to get out of. But they did. It failed militarily. John Brown was captured, tried, and hung. So militarily, it failed. Certainly, it didn't lead to an uprising of enslaved people. But was it in some sense a propaganda success? That's a harder call. At the start of the Civil War, Union troops often marched along singing about John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. And in a very nice irony, Julia Ward Howe was challenged to write better words to go with that tune, producing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which, thinking back to last month's session, that's a Unitarian written song or hymn that hasn't appeared in either of the hymnals produced since the merger of Unitarians and Universalists. To find it in one of our books, you have to go back to the 1939 hymnal. Interesting. But any thoughts about John Brown's raid and some of the, was this a decent use of the right of conscience? Or did it really fail the test? Maybe even prospectively.
Well, having a martyr can be kind of handy to a movement.
Yeah, that's true. And it did have some of that effect here.
On the other hand, it was violent, and the other two resistances that you mentioned, plus of course the civil rights movement, were non-violent. There's that problem with it.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good segue to the last thing that I want to present. The very complex exercise of the right of conscience, using the example of Robert Williams and Monroe, North Carolina. Because there, the right of conscience called for armed Black self-defense. So, Monroe, North Carolina is a town, small city, south and east of Charlotte. In the 1920s, the population was about 6,100. And one journalist observed Monroe has 5 churches, 4 Republicans, 1 pool hall, and 1 whorehouse. By the 1950s and 60s, it had grown. It's now over 30,000 as part of metropolitan Charlotte. Monroe is the hometown of Senator Jesse Helms. Jesse Helms Sr. was assistant police chief and then fire chief in Monroe. Senator Helms liked to remember that his first grade teacher in Monroe was his, quote, favorite unreconstructed Confederate. So there was a certain rightward leaning repressive element there. But Monroe was also the hometown of a man named J. Ray Shute. Ray Shute came from one of the leading white families. They had lived there in Union County for 8 generations, had never moved more than 20 miles from there. Ray Shute owned several businesses, stores on Main Street, cotton gin, some other lumber mill. And he'd held various public offices. He'd chaired the school board. He had chaired the county commission. He had served as state senator from Union County. And in 1947, he was elected mayor of Monroe. Ray Shute.
Okay.
Ray Shute was not of a mindset similar to Jesse Helms. He was part of a liberal discussion group that met at a local radio station.
How are you?
How are you?
Doing fine. How are you?
Good.
And
I wanted to know if you could borrow.
yeah, thanks, Mary Jo. And in 1948, 12 members of that discussion group drove into Charlotte, started attending services at the Unitarian Church in Charlotte, that Carolyn Franks is well familiar with, and joined it. Then a little later in 1948, they decided, actually, let's start a fellowship, a Unitarian fellowship here in Monroe. So they did. And in 1952, the membership, which had risen all the way to 20, this was a small operation, but among those 20 were the city clerk, the county librarian, and the chair of the county hospital board, and Ray Shute. So, some solid people. In 1956, Ray Shute, who had never been comfortable with segregation, organized what he called the Union County Council on Human Relations. Not to bring radical change, but to offer, quote, opportunities for discussion and fact-finding with members of both races. The president of the Council on Human Relations was Dr. Albert Perry, a Black obstetrician gynecologist who had married a Union County woman and set up his practice there. Vice president was Ray Shute, and the secretary was Mabel Williams, which brings us to Robert and Mabel Williams. Robert had been born in Monroe, left Monroe to go to college, serve in the military, work, but he had returned. And at this point, I think he would have been in his early 30s. Now, he attended college. He didn't complete a degree. He served in both the Army and the Marine Corps and was discharged from both of those branches of service because apparently he had a low tolerance for arbitrary authority and racism. And, he had come back to Monroe. In 1956, the NAACP chapter was dwindling. It was mostly middle-class Black people who weren't really comfortable with the new militants, the Brown versus Board of Education and the bus boycott in Montgomery. And so it was down to about 5 or 6 members. They were glad to elect Robert Williams as the new president of the Monroe branch of the NAACP. And Robert went about rebuilding it, building in more average people. Also, in March of 56, Robert Williams was the speaker at a service of the Unitarian Fellowship. He talked about the Montgomery bus boycott, which was then about 3 or 4 months along. Apparently, he continued to be around the fellowship because in September of 56, he became the first Black member of the fellowship. Now, I can't tell you how long he remained active in that congregation. So, that's an unanswered question on what I've been able to research. But he certainly remained active in the community. In the summer of 57, he and various other Black leaders sought desegregation of the public swimming pool. Democratic process had put their federal and local taxes into building the swimming pool. But democratic process did not put their Black bodies in the water. They saw this as a problem. Yeah. In October of 57, after a large Klan rally in a neighboring county, a Klan motorcade drove up to the home of Dr. Albert Perry, the Black physician, president of the Council on Human Relations. The Klan fired at Dr. Perry's house. What was different this time was that they were expected. Robert Williams and several other service veterans were there waiting for them in carefully prepared and chosen positions and returned fire. Apparently they fired low, they didn't fire to kill. The Klan left much faster than they had arrived. The next night, there was a warrant served on Dr. Perry, charging criminal abortion on a white woman. Not clear from the wording whether abortion was more offensive than the race of the purported patient, victim, whatever you want to call it. He was taken down to the jail, and the Black community, particularly Black women, responded by surrounding the police department and insisting that bond be set for Dr. Perry. Well, that was ultimately arranged, and Ray Shute signed the $7,500 bond for Dr. Perry. Ultimately, the trial of this charge dragged on for an extended period. Ultimately, there was a conviction and he served some kind of sentence. So that was the 57. 1958. This just keeps going and going. In 1958, there was the kissing case. An interracial group of elementary school kids were playing at the border area between white and Black neighborhoods. At some point, one of the white girls suggested a game that involved kissing. When her mother learned later that day that she had kissed a Black boy or been kissed by him, whatever. Ah! The end result was that two black boys, ages 8 and 10, were sentenced to long stays in juvenile reform. That was the excitement of 1958. In 1959, on May 5th, two cases went to trial in Monroe. One, a case of simple assault. A white man had been accused of assaulting a hotel housekeeper. Apparently, he was still very, very hungover when the housekeeper knocked on his hotel room door. He charged out. As I recall the description, he shoved her down the stairs. And he was charged with assault. Sounds like assault to me. He declined to appear for trial, and the charges were dropped. The second case, a little weightier, attempted rape. Again, person on trial, a white male. The victim of the attempt was a black woman. She testified very clearly and specifically about what had happened. There was also testimony from a white woman who had witnessed this attempt. The jury was out 45 minutes. Not guilty. At this point, Robert Williams snapped. He said to a reporter, "We must be willing to kill if necessary. We cannot take these people who do us injustice to the court, and it becomes necessary to punish them ourselves. Since the federal government will not bring a halt to lynching in the South, and since the so-called courts lynch our people legally, if it's necessary to stop lynching with lynching, then we must be willing to resort to that method." This could be described as intemperate, because it was. It could also be readily understood. He had just seen two instances of clearly guilty white assailants let off scot-free. And this was certainly not the first time. Not after this sequence of events in Monroe. But because what he said was intemperate, the National Office of the NAACP suspended him as president of the Monroe chapter, Monroe branch. But the publicity around this also led to Williams being invited to come to New York City. On his trips to New York City, he had meetings with Malcolm X, with Fidel Castro, who was in town to address the United Nations. It also led to pro and con articles in Liberation magazine. Robert Williams, Martin Luther King Jr., in dialogue about the use of violence in self-protection. So things had changed a little bit. Robert Williams, now widely known, used public relations and the leverage of fame, but also armed self-defense. And Robert Williams used his prominence to leverage world attention to obtain results in Monroe. In his 1962 book, Negroes with Guns, Williams reports, this is a long quote, "World protest saved 2 young boys from 14-year reformatory sentences in the Monroe kissing case. In 1960, when the Monroe city officials drafted an urban renewal plan calling for federal slum clearance funds to condemn and destroy the houses of the colored community, we telegraphed a protest appeal to honorary NAACP member Jawaharlal Nehru, who at that moment had President Eisenhower as his guest in India. The Federal Housing Administration subsequently refused to approve the Monroe Project. In 1961, after the Cuban invasion fiasco, when President Kennedy justified US intervention for the cause of freedom, we sent an open telegram, read at the United Nations, to the president, requesting equivalent US tanks, airplanes, artillery, machine guns, and mercenary troops to fight the Klan in North Carolina. Then, in the late summer of 1961, tensions mounted further. Freedom riders, black and white, who had been released from jail in Mississippi, came to Monroe at Robert Williams' invitation to support local blacks who were demonstrating about the still segregated swimming pool and other issues. James Foreman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, paid a return visit to Monroe at Williams' invitation. Area whites, including Klan members, responded with violence and threats of violence. On Sunday, August 28, the situation got totally out of hand, apparently because Ray Shute had a reputation as a liberal. 15 shots were fired into his house. Robert and Mabel Williams, accused of kidnapping a white couple who had taken refuge in their house, fled from their home and from Monroe. So, armed black self-defense. Was it a legitimate and appropriate use of the right of conscience? That's a harder question. And I think we can be rather judgmental of some of the poorly informed choices of John Brown at Harper's Ferry and those who supported him. But here, yeah, it's hard. So I'd be interested in hearing from others of you. Okay, armed black self-defense when there is no defense from those in authority. Thoughts? John.
I as I was reading over Robert F. Williams, it's a fascinating history because when he leaves Monroe, he goes to Cuba, and he's like in Cuba in exile for a number of years, and broadcasts on Radio Free Dixie once a week, and it gets broadcast all over the South. He had an endorsement for his charter, his rifle club from the National Rifle Association. The NRA backed his organization. It's fascinating. So I just thought those pieces of information were interesting, but I don't know. This is an extreme case, but I think there's parallels here, at least in observation, to the critique of folks like Colin Kaepernick. You know, the kneeling protest. Well, that's disrespectful. Okay, but nobody listens to the arguments. And then, you know, we have someone like George Floyd who gets killed, and all of a sudden people are like, well, why do people have to be so violent? Well, it's like you're not listening to us when we're peaceful. You're not. So there's that critique of somebody like me can protest something, write a letter to the editor, and it gets picked up, versus other folks who have marginalized identities and they petition and are largely ignored. It's hard to ignore somebody with a gun.
Yeah. Others? Yeah, Chaz.
I would just say that I'm personally surprised that there has not been more violent Black resistance. I had when I was in college, I was pretty immature, but I had a professor who had a lot of power over me and was really horrible and hateful. And I contemplated acts of violence toward him just from that one relationship. And when I think about Black people who've endured generations of not just bad treatment, but killing, I can understand why somebody like Robert Williams was mad. And I'm very surprised there aren't more of him. I also just like to put out there, if anybody's interested, there is a guy who posts YouTube videos almost every day. What's his name? It was on my tip of my tongue a minute ago. Bo, B-O, of the Fifth Column. And you can look up Fifth Column if you want to. But he's a country boy, a smart, educated redneck kind of person, and he's always speaking against what's going on in this country in terms of politics and economics and so forth. He's very articulate, but he had one particular diatribe that caught my attention in a different way. He said I have a background in law enforcement, and you Black people that are watching this need to know that the white folks are coming to get you again. It's going to be worse than ever. And you need to arm yourselves. You need to get as many guns as you can, and I will teach you how to use them. So that and some other things I've seen made me think that if this country is getting more violent, which it seems to be, armed Black resistance is going to be part of that violence, with some white support, just like John Brown situation. And I don't know what to do with that, but I'm just kind of putting it out there as things that I've seen and felt and I'm not surprised by.
Yeah. Okay. Other inputs? Larry?
On that line, the Boogaloo Boys, there are right-wing militia groups that are specifically trying to instigate that exact thing. They are really excited about starting up a race war. And that's what some of the instigators have been in some of the Black protests, when some of those right-wing guys go in and, bust open the auto zone and say free shit for everybody, and really egg it on just to make their case, so when they come in with their guns like that, 16-year-old kid did, then they're seen by a bunch as heroes, and that's what they want. We really need some leadership to calm this down. We need to have the federal authorities looking into the right-wing groups, calming it down.
Yeah. And, Lori, let's get your input.
Oh, I'm going off on a tangent. Former member of the congregation I serve is a Black man, and he was a student at the South Carolina University in Orangeburg when they had a riot. And he knew the young men who were shot and killed during that riot. And he goes armed. I mean, I don't think he's ever not armed.
No.
And we talked about it. And, I said, but don't you worry, James, that because you're armed, you'll be killed? And he said, they're going to kill me anyway.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting developments is that a few years ago, Charlie Cobb, who was an active member of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, wrote this book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, which paraphrases something that a longtime Mississippi civil rights leader said to Dr. King. And he notes it was in Monroe that the principal practice of armed self-defense first converged with the modern civil rights movement's emergent tactics and strategies of nonviolence. And he actually documents to an interesting degree the fact that, there was nonviolence, but there was also self-protection. SNCC workers staying in homes of Black farmers. Almost always, there was at least one gun in that house, typically near the front door. And, the question became, okay, I'm nonviolent, but if the Klan shows up and there's an extra gun, should I or should I not pick it up? And I remember some years ago when we lived in Mississippi, noticing that there was a magazine ad by the NRA featuring somebody, John Salter, whom I knew had been an active part of the movement in Mississippi and, devoted to nonviolence. And Salter speaking up for gun rights. And I asked his good friend, who's also a good friend of mine, Ed King, about this, and Ed said, oh yeah, guns were really important. When, the Klan kept coming onto the Tougaloo College campus and shooting up our house and various other houses. And that stopped when a few of the students posted guard duty. And if the Klan showed up and got off a shot came back at them and they stopped coming in here. So, it's forced me, and Cobb's book is an interesting argument that, okay, nonviolence, yes, but. So, anyhow.
Or maybe it's yes and,
Yeah.
not yes, but. Yes and.
It seems to be. And I know we are getting to a stopping point. We're not all eager to get to the debate later tonight. If we're tuning in, we need to steel ourselves for it. But John mentioned some of this. It's what old radio personality Paul Harvey would say, and now the rest of the story. Robert and Mabel Williams escaped to New York, then Canada, then Cuba. Fidel Castro, who had met Robert Williams previously in New York and Havana, Robert had been invited to visit in Havana, welcomed him to Cuba, and soon Robert and Mabel Williams were broadcasting Radio Free Dixie from Cuba to most of the eastern US. The radio broadcasts and Williams' book, Negroes with Guns, influenced from a distance such organizations as Deacons for Defense and the Black Panther Party. As the welcome in Cuba waned, the Williams family moved to North Vietnam. I want to see and understand what's happening there, US aggression, and then on to China. In China, Williams was accorded honors and attention. Robert and Mabel Williams were provided an apartment in a former Italian embassy building, servants, and a limousine. And Williams met with Mao, Zhou Enlai, and other leaders. He wrote to a friend in the US, on October 1, China's National Day, I was allowed to stand beside Chairman Mao on the Tiananmen as a representative of oppressed Afro-Americans and deliver an uncensored speech to 1.5 million people. While Williams was in exile, Malcolm X referred to him as, quote, a very good friend of mine. Robert Williams returned to the United States on September 12, 1969. He slowly backed away from the eager but doctrinaire embrace of younger Black militants who offered him honorary positions in their organizations, Revolutionary Action Movement, Republic of New Africa. Gradually, he worked out his legal problems and provided firsthand information to academics and probably indirectly to Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon on conditions and leading personalities in the Chinese government. He died in Michigan on October 15th, 1996 of Hodgkin's disease. For his funeral at Central Methodist Church in Monroe, his body was dressed in a gray suit that had been a gift from Chairman Mao. Rosa Parks, in her remarks at the funeral, said that she and others in the movement, quote, always admired Robert Williams for his courage and his commitment to freedom. The work he did should go down in history and never be forgotten. Wow. Not bad for a guy, no college degree, booted out of 2 branches of service, demoted by the National Office of the NAACP. But he did some stuff. He made something of his life. However you evaluate the choices that he made and led the Black community in Monroe to make, he did something. So that is the right of conscience and the use of democratic process when it's available within our congregations and in society at large. Interesting stuff, how we Unitarian Universalists work on these things, live these principles more or less well. We don't bat 1,000. But next month, it's the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And we will be meeting a Unitarian minister who is an early promoter of Gandhi in America, a founding member of both the ACLU and the NAACP, and not always loved for doing all that good stuff. Actually, sort of was a Unitarian in exile from the American Unitarian Association for an interesting number of years. We just don't do boring history. Good to be with you all tonight. And I'll hang in for a couple of minutes if any of you have closing things that you want to ask about or suggest or talk about. But
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Gordon.
Gordon. But I will add, moral history is never boring.
yeah. Well, I am having fun with these monthly visits with you all. Thank you for tuning in.
I appreciate you doing them, Gordon. I think it's been real fun.
Okay.
I think I need to make this a priority, Gordon.
Well,
It
yeah.
keeps shifting, you know, day of week keeps shifting every
Yeah.
month. So.
Yeah, which is a hazard, but I thought, okay, it can also be a plus because, oh, I couldn't sign up for that because I'm always
Right.
doing this on Wednesdays. Or
Sure.
so I thought,
Well, thank
okay,
you for doing it.
keeps me from sitting around being bored. Fat chance.
It will be on a Saturday next month.
I know. I have to look. Oh, but it's the Saturday before I'm sharing the pulpit with someone.
Okay.
So
Saturdays are always problematic, but with online services, sometimes Saturday shifts to Wednesday because it has to be recorded by them.
we don't record. We do them live,
Okay.
which is, everybody does it differently.
There are pluses and minuses. Here we've realized that with pre-recording, there can be a significant death in the congregation on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, and no, it's not there in the recording.
Right. That's the problem. And I would rather be able to rewrite something on Saturday night
Or Sunday morning.
or Sunday morning. That's happened too.
Let's be real. Yeah. Okay.
Well, someday we will be able to meet in person again, I hope.
Devoutly hope. Actually, one of the ideas pre-coronavirus that I was encouraging Living Legacy Project to play with is an Eastern itinerary that would take us through Georgia and South